held me up so that I could see out the kitchen window. And he said, a little ways across the yard, under a pine tree, was a white Bigfoot. And he was digging in the snow and picking things up out of the snow or off the ground and putting them in his mouth. And I was like, what? Are you kidding me? And, and he was completely serious. And he recalled that its fingernails kind of looked like claws, that they were a dark gray color, that they were kind of long, they looked dirty. He said it was bigger than the Bigfoot that we saw walking in the yard that day. And so when I think about this, if he saw the Bigfoot digging in the snow, that must have been the winter of 2005, 2006. He would have been 5 by then. And the encounter that I remember happened in August. So it would have been before that, in the fall before, the day that I saw it while doing dishes, that I don't have any recollection of. And it was unsettling to me that happened, that I saw a Bigfoot sitting outside while I was doing dishes. My son clearly remembers it, but I didn't. It was unsettling. It made me wonder, did other things happen that I don't remember? Was that because it scared me so bad that I forgot? Was it something that the Bigfoot could have done to cause me to forget? I was very grateful that I remembered the day that he walked into the yard. But I think also some of the reason for that might be that because nobody had answers for me, and none of the adults in my life treated it as if it were any big deal that this unknown creature walked into the yard one day. It just wasn't talked about. And so I guess there was nothing I could do that I knew to do when I saw them. And so I just continued to do dishes, and my son said he went back in the living room and kept playing with Spider-Man toys, and life went on. So after talking to my son when he was a teenager about those encounters, I was then living in Michigan, and things started to happen on that land and around that house. At this point, we lived on 8 acres. We had the Shiawassee River running through that property. We had a large front yard with a great big vegetable garden and a fairly big backyard. And we had nature trails through the wooded part of the property that we lived on. And my kids and I would go walking through those nature trails all the time. We would drive our golf cart through them. And I would often go alone. It was very peaceful for me. I would go walk to the ridge that overlooked the river. And down by the river, it was nothing but mud. So I wouldn't go down there, but I would sit and lean against a great big tree up on this ridge. And I would read, sometimes I would write, and it was just very peaceful. Well, one day I found footprints in the nature trails in a low area where it was quite muddy. And other things had been happening before then that had me wondering, were there Sasquatch in the area? And I really had a hard time allowing myself to believe that that could be possible, because even with as much as I had learned, I had not heard about people being marked or tagged. I had not learned that many people who had seen one somewhere often saw them or had experiences with them again later, even in a totally different location. I hadn't learned that yet. So to myself, I was thinking, okay, what are the odds that I would have a Sasquatch walk into my yard in Missouri, and then I'd move 14 hours away to Michigan and have Sasquatch activity there? This just can't be possible. This has got to be in my head. There's no way. And my husband at the time, he had grown up on the land adjacent to the land we were living on and roamed those woods his entire childhood. He hunted, he trapped, had never seen a Bigfoot out there, and told me, there's no way they're here. Maybe that's what you saw in Missouri. I don't know. But I do know they are not in these woods here in Michigan. They're not. And so I would go out to feed my beagle. He was a hunting dog, so he was kept outside. And I would go out to feed him, and I would have to go and get his food bowl out of the tree line that was about 5 feet or so away from his doghouse where his food bowl was kept. And we kept his food and water bowl where he could reach it, but where his cable wouldn't knock it over. So when it was in the tree line, it was beyond his reach. And I kept wondering, how and why is his food bowl getting in the trees all the time? It became a normal thing. And I mentioned it to my husband, and he did not seem to give it a second thought. Didn't really concern him at all. And so it just became a thing. You go get the bowl out of the tree line, you fill it back up with dog food, and the next morning you go and get it out of the tree line again. And then in the dining room of that home, I had my computer desk. And I was going to college online at the time, so I spent a lot of time at that computer desk, and there was a great big window there in the dining room to my right. And I was sitting right next to it. And so late night hours, I would have the lights on, and I would be sitting there studying and working. And I started hearing what sounded like rocks being thrown at the window one night, which didn't make any sense to me because there aren't even rocks in that area that I was aware of. There wasn't any gravel, and it sounded like little pieces of gravel hitting the window. And it was often enough that I could tell it wasn't just random. It wasn't like, an acorn fell and hit the window and that was it. It kept happening while I was sitting there that night. And that was right where my beagle was, outside. That's where he was. But I was up high. The window was probably about 20 feet off the ground or so. But I do remember getting this feeling like, ooh, there's something out there throwing stuff at my window. Like, what in the world? And I think I got up and went to bed. And by that point in my life, I had just grown to kind of keep things to myself. I didn't feel like my husband understood or could provide any validation. And if anything, he would tell me, no, that's nothing throwing anything at the window. And the dog bowl, none of it. None of it means anything. So I just started keeping everything to myself. Well, then that day that I was out in the trails and I came across the prints, that was something much more solid. And I took pictures of them, and they weren't very large. They were larger than my foot, and I wear about a size 6. But they were bare, human-like footprints in the mud. And if there was some human barefoot walking through my trails on our land, that was an issue. That would be a safety issue. And so I mentioned that, of course, to my husband, and he didn't like it. He was concerned, but he didn't have any answers for it. So I started to take bags of carrots, and I don't know why bags of carrots. I must have read something or something. I would take bags of carrots and I would hang them up as high as I could get them in trees out in this property. And I would go back in a few days and I would check them, and they weren't ever disturbed. But I remember the land was really awesome. In Michigan, there are great big pine trees, big enough where I could kind of hunch down a little bit and walk underneath of them onto these plush beds of pine needles. And my kids and I would sit out there on those pine needles, and we would have picnics, and we would sing songs, just have a good time. And so nothing ever took the carrots. But after seeing those prints, I was like, okay, maybe there really is something here. My daughter was outside playing one day by herself, and she came bursting through the front door, very scared, very upset, and said, "Mommy, Mommy, Mommy, there are monsters chasing me. There are monsters chasing me." And, I go to her and I hold her and I'm like, "It's okay, you're safe. I'm here, you're here." I shut and locked the door, and I'm like, "What do you mean? There were monsters chasing me?" And she said, "They were running after me. They were running after me. They were chasing me." And she was crying. She was very upset. And so I helped to calm her down. And I don't remember what we did after that, but I probably just distracted her and played for a little while and helped to soothe her and calm her down. She was either 4 or 5 at the time. And I didn't really think anything of it. I didn't connect dots at the time while I was living there. I never would have, I didn't think at the time that to a young child, a Sasquatch, if that might have been what it was, would very much look like a monster. And maybe that's what a child would call a Sasquatch if they saw one. That didn't even cross my mind, and I regret that now because I should have done more to go out and investigate and to also make sure that my kids were safe when they went outside and played. I assumed that because they were right outside the house and they were right there, that they were safe, that our dog was with them. I had a pit bull as well, and he would go outside and play, be with them while they were out there playing. And I just assumed that they were safe because they were that close. And I thank God that they were never hurt, but I do know now that that possibility exists. There was another thing that happened while living in that house in Michigan. I'm not sure. I think my daughter was about 5 at the time. And she came running down the hallway from the kitchen, dining, living area to my bedroom. And she said, "Mom, I just saw a giant wolf tail in the kitchen, go through the kitchen door." And I didn't, I think pretty typical thing. Just, "You saw what? What?" And she said, "There's a giant wolf tail in the kitchen. It was going through the door." And I said, "Well, show me." And so we walked down the hallway. Our kitchen had 2 doorways, one that went in from the living room and one that went out into the dining room. And off the other dining room wall, the opposite wall of the kitchen doorway, was a deck and sliding glass doors. And I would often have the sliding glass door open because if the weather was nice, and I would just shut the screen door because the sliding glass door was very hard to open and close. At one point, it didn't have a handle. And I've always been one to love having windows open and the breeze coming through. I don't recall if that day if the screen door was open or if the glass door was closed. But I really didn't think that it could be a reality that a giant wolf could be in my kitchen. It just didn't seem like that could be a reality. And yet, my daughter had never hallucinated that I had ever been aware of. She did not tell stories about seeing things when she wasn't seeing something. She wasn't one to do that. So I don't know why I didn't investigate further. I remember looking in the kitchen and clearly not seeing anything that wasn't supposed to be there. I don't remember seeing anything anywhere in the house. I didn't see that there was anything to be concerned about. And yet, very clearly now, I do. And that's difficult for me to understand about myself because I had already seen the Sasquatch in Missouri. And though I was having a hard time wrapping my head around the fact that they could possibly be in Michigan, and least of all on land that I was on, again, what are the odds? A giant wolf, I had never even heard of such a thing. So I was speaking with my daughter recently, who is a teenager now, and we were talking about the Sasquatch encounter that her brother and I had before she was born. And I told her, I think they were around that house that we lived in when you were growing up. And she said, "Yeah, I saw a lot of weird things at that house." And I said, "What did you see? What happened?" And she said, "Well, I don't know what it was, but there were these big wolves walking outside of our windows, walking in the yard." And she said, "I just remember looking out the windows and seeing big wolves walking around." And to her, it was just a common thing. She didn't know that there weren't supposed to be big wolves walking around the yard. But I'm glad she knew that for them to be in the kitchen wasn't normal. But even when she told me, I didn't really do anything. I couldn't give her any answers, so it makes sense that she, from what I recall, I don't remember her mentioning that to me when she was younger, when she was actually seeing the wolves walking around outside. But she does remember them walking. So I live in Missouri again now, and I actually live a little over an hour, possibly closer to 2 hours, from Lone, Missouri, where my Sasquatch encounter took place. And I've been living here since about July. I live on about 40 acres. And I decided one day to walk out to this big tree out in the corner of the front yard by the tree line. It's 2 ways away from the front door, but I can see it. And being that I know Sasquatch exists and that they can be anywhere, learned that, I decided to walk out there one day and introduce myself. In case there were any around, tell them my name and let them know I'm a friend and that I don't mean them any harm, and to also ask them, please don't scare me. So that's what I did. I walked out there one day and I left the dogs inside and I told them those things and I just made conversation for about 30 minutes. And when I was done, I thought, well, I'm going to take a few pictures. And I haven't seen or heard anything, but I just thought I'll just take a few pictures of the woods, see if I see anything later when I look at them. And so I reach in my back pocket to grab my phone, and I hear this really loud crack from behind me. And I had been standing in between the tree line and this great big tree. And so when that crack happened, I jumped and I turned and I took like 5 fast steps towards the house. And then I realized that's not what I wanted to do. I didn't want to be afraid. If I could go back to my original encounter, if I could go back to that day, knowing what I know now, I might have still gotten up and gotten my son and gone inside, but I would not have been as afraid. I wouldn't have had to wonder what I was seeing. I would have had the name. I would have had the answer for the Sasquatch that was in my yard. So I feel I would have been much better prepared and much less traumatized, much less afraid. And maybe I even would have said hello. I don't know. So that day that I was out there talking by the tree and I heard that loud crack and I started taking off towards the house, I said, no, you're not going to be afraid this time. You're not running this time. You're okay. You're all right. Just take a breath, turn back around. And so that's what I did. I turned around, I apologized, I said, I'm sorry. I'm really trying not to be afraid. I'm just nervous. But I'm here. I'm here. And stood there for a little bit longer, might have said a few more things, and then I was like, okay, I'm done. Nothing else is happening. And take a few pictures. So I go to reach for my phone again, and again, another loud crack. And the best way I can describe it is that there's a fairly big tree limb on the ground that someone was kind of dead and someone steps on it really hard and breaks it. That's what it sounded like. And so I was looking at the ground around this tree, trying to see what's making that noise. How did that happen? I didn't even think to look up in the tree. And this was probably mid-August, late August or so when I did that. So the tree was full of leaves and the tree line was impossible to see far into. But when that second crack happened, when I was reaching for my phone again, I was like, okay, nope, I'm out. And I went inside and I shut and locked the door and I was like, wow, that, I don't know, was that something or not? But it definitely made me nervous. So I'm not sure how much time passed, not a whole lot of time, maybe a few days, possibly a week or so. I was going to the restroom and my boyfriend and I live in a shop building is basically what it is. I like it. It's pretty cool, actually. It's got a kitchen and a bath, door and windows and walls and closets. It's got all of that, but it's a shop building. So the walls on the outside are tin, and they're not very thick walls. So I'm using the restroom, and right behind me on the wall, behind the toilet, I hear this incredibly loud bang, and I almost thought the wall was coming down on me. I really couldn't jump, flinched and punched and was like, wow, what is, it scared me. But I just sat there and had no idea what it was. But right after the big bang on the wall, it sounded like thunder rolled toward the tree line. And it had not been storming that day. I had not heard thunder at all before that. And I didn't hear thunder for the rest of the day after that. It didn't storm. It didn't even rain. I didn't see any lightning. So I had no idea what that was. But it caught my attention. And with what I've learned, I do know that Sasquatches will bang on homes. And I've since learned that sometimes it's the juvenile Sasquatches that do that. So it possibly could have been that. And I'm getting better about not discounting me to be afraid, but also not invalidating their occurrence. And I've also learned about how it can be common for people who've seen one Sasquatch, even if it's in Missouri, to go to Missouri and have it happen again in a different location. I know that's not impossible. So I had that loud bang happen, and that's what sounded like thunder going back towards the tree line. And when my boyfriend got home, I asked him about it, and he said maybe it was a sonic boom. And I don't know that I've ever heard a sonic boom before, so I don't know what they would sound like, but I have a hard time understanding how that would cause for an impact on a wall, directly on the wall. It didn't sound like a distant thing. I mean, but when I checked the wall outside, there was no damage. It didn't look like the grass around the building had been smashed. It didn't look like anything had been disturbed. And I asked my boyfriend, I said, could something have been on the roof? And he said, if there was anything on the roof, it would cave in. The roof would cave in. Anything of any significant amount of weight would cause the roof to cave in. So that's lovely. So I hope that doesn't happen. So it was September 11th, and my boyfriend had mentioned an old cemetery on some land that adjoins the land that we live on. And I've always had an appreciation for older cemeteries, and I feel like maybe it's kind in a way to go and to read the headstones of those people that lived their lives and were here, and to just read their names and remember them. And so we went there on September 11th. There were some soldiers that were buried there. And we're walking around. It took about 3 minutes through the woods from our home to get to the cemetery. And it's wooded. The way to get there is wooded, but a little bit of it has been cleared with a brush hog. Not cleared very well. It was very difficult to get through the terrain. The man that used to own this land that I live on, I guess it was his grandfather that owned this thing, they had it completely cleared, I believe for cattle and possibly some crops. But it is pretty much all of it has grown up now with, I guess, some invasive species. There's briars everywhere. It is such difficult terrain to traverse because the briars, these thorns, 2-3 inches long, and they're everywhere. And so even where the brush hog has cleared, it's still slow going. It's still walking over a lot of limbs, and there's just really rugged ground. But it took us about 3 minutes, even for that, to get to the cemetery. And the cemetery is surrounded by a chain link fence. It's still being used to this day, I believe, by a family, a couple families. And they have a company that comes out and keeps it mowed and keeps an area near it mowed where people can park their cars. There's no parking lot, they just park in the grass. So we're inside the chain link fence and we're walking around, and it's a fairly good sized cemetery, I would say. I'm not good with mathematical estimations, but I would say maybe 400-500 feet long and maybe almost as wide as kind of a big square. And it's got a lot of open space. There aren't headstones filling up the whole thing. There's a lot of open space. But in the section where the older headstones were is where I was, and I walked all around the cemetery, decided to take some pictures because I've heard that it is a possibility for orbs to be seen where Sasquatch are, or where they could be. And I have a friend who has seen orbs and Sasquatch about 30 minutes from where I live. And I thought, wouldn't that be really cool to see an orb? And I've heard other people say that sometimes in cemeteries they can be seen. And I've also heard that sometimes they'll show up on camera even when you can't see them with your naked eye. So I had my phone out and I was taking pictures of the headstones and around the cemetery. And it was getting dark. It was maybe 7:30 or so, maybe 8, I don't remember exactly. But it was dusk at this point, and I knew we needed to get back home. I didn't want to be walking through the woods at dark. And I was just about to turn my camera off and put my phone away when without thinking about it, I turned the flash on my phone. I turned to my left, facing the chain link fence and the woods, and I took a picture. I hadn't seen anything. I hadn't heard anything. I didn't have any feelings of being watched. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't afraid. I don't know why I took that picture. It was just trees. That's all I knew, but I did. I took it. And I put my phone away, and I look around, and I couldn't find my boyfriend. I didn't see him anywhere, and I thought, well, maybe he's bending down reading a headstone, so I'm looking more closely, looking behind headstones. I don't see him anywhere, and I got a little nervous, and so I hollered his name, and he yelled back to me from a clearing on the other side of the tree line from the cemetery. And I guess this large clearing back there piqued his interest. He didn't know what it was for. And we don't really know at this point what it was for. So he comes walking from that direction, and we meet back up, and we decided to walk the road quite a bit longer. So about 3 days go by, and I hadn't looked at the pictures that I had taken that night, but I did look at them after I would snap them. It would show a preview on my phone, and I wasn't looking anymore. So I didn't think there was anything in the photographs that was worth looking back on. But I decided to, nevertheless. Scrolling through, and I get to that last picture that I took of the tree line on the other side of the fence from the cemetery. And I thought, I wonder if there's anything in there. And I zoom in, and I'm panning around, and all of a sudden I see this face. And I'm like, wait a minute.
Alright, y'all. See you later. Time to go inside. Until the next time. Trying to put my shoes on till the next time. Bye. Bye, you guys. I'll see y'all later.